Welcome to the Veterinary Project Podcast, episode 008.
Welcome to the show created by vets featuring absolutely no pets. This is the Veterinary Project Podcast, hosted by Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light. Our resident veterinarians have swapped out their stethoscopes in favor of microphones to bring you the Veterinary Project Podcast, a show focused on real conversations, aimed to connect this amazing profession full of remarkable people. Through the sharing of collective stories and wisdom, and connecting over the many unique challenges we face, we invite you to join our community of veterinary professionals leading intentional lives. And now, here are the hosts of the Veterinary Project Podcast, Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light.
Welcome back to the Veterinary Project Podcast. You are joined by yours truly, Dr. Jonathan Light and Dr. Michael Bugg. Mike, how you doing this afternoon?
I am doing very well, Jonathan. It's harvest time out here, so I go and help my dad run a combine, so carved out a few hours to rip back to the city for this conversation. But other than that, it's pretty hectic time.
Excellent. And from what I've gathered is you were being really productive on that combine as well.
Yeah, I mean, the combine's an interesting place nowadays. There's so much GPS in that, so I just listen to podcasts and webinars. Honestly, I even watch YouTube videos now because you have so much free time in there. So 16 hours a day of content consumption.
Look at that, and being productive while you're on the farm. That's fantastic. Well, we have a great episode this afternoon here with Dr. Brent Mayabb. But before we get into that, Mike, I know you've got a special quick tip today, so let's get into it.
Yeah, so our conversation with Brent is around money and personal finance. For anyone that knows me, this is probably my number one favorite topic to dive into, and especially in the veterinary industry and helping veterinarians. So I wanted to keep my quick tip kind of money focused, and this is one of my personal favorite reframes, I guess I would call it, to help keep my personal spending in check and stick to a budget. And my reframe is to think of all the money I spend in terms of time. So to give you a quick example, let's just pretend I'm out shopping for something, a piece of clothing or a jacket or something that's $100. And I know that I'm going to have to earn about $150, I round up, to be able to pay for that jacket. So I will think of that in terms of hours that I need to work. So if I make $50 an hour, I know that I need to work 3 hours to buy that piece of clothing. If I make $75 an hour, I know I have to work 2 hours to buy that piece of clothing. And so what this does for me is it gets me in that mindset of thinking, do I really want to work hard for 3 hours to be able to afford this? And that gets it really clear if what I'm about to purchase is a need or a want, and keeps my spending in check. So that would be my quick tip today for anyone listening, is to think of especially your consumer purchases, your consumer goods, in terms of how much time will you need to work to afford that purchase.
Mike, I love that quick tip. And that in itself could be a whole other conversation that we get into. So thank you very much for sharing. I think that'll be very relevant to our listeners out there. So moving on, before we get into our episode this afternoon, I want to introduce our guest. Our guest today is Dr. Brent Mayabb. He is currently the Global Chief Medical Officer for Royal Canin, where he's responsible for being the medical liaison between Royal Canin and large multi-hospital veterinary practice groups around the world. He joined Royal Canin USA back in May 2004 and has held many jobs in between, including roles in HR and corporate affairs, with responsibilities in areas as diverse as public relations and government affairs. Prior to joining Royal Canin, Brent worked in a small animal practice in Granite City, and he continues to do relief work in small animal practice. When not working, Brent spends some of his time volunteering at events with the Animal Protective Association of Missouri and as a board member of the Banfield Foundation. Brent earned his DVM from the University of Missouri College of Veterinary Medicine in 1999, and Brent and his wife, Julie, also a vet and classmate, have a dog named Eli and a cat named Tessa. In today's conversation, Brent, Mike, and I dive deep into the money conversation, first focusing in on Brent's financial position coming out of school and what that looked like debt-wise, how Brent associated and turned his money mindset and the journey that it has taken over the years. And we also spend time discussing around getting started towards financial literacy and all of the different options that are available to us. So without further ado, please join me in enjoying this conversation with Dr. Brent Mayabb. Brent, we are so happy to have you with us this afternoon. It means a lot to have you take time out of your busy schedule to spend a half hour, 45 minutes talking through what I think is going to be a great conversation for our community this afternoon. So very grateful to have you on our podcast. Thank you.
Well, thank you guys for having me. I'm really excited to talk about this as well.
Excellent. And before we dive into the conversation, I'm going to put a plug in for our YouTube videos. For everybody, you need to go onto YouTube and look at Brent's setup for this podcast. It's pretty something, and we might have to talk about it a little bit at the end in terms of some of the instruments that are behind the scenes.
Fantastic.
Excellent. So now that we've made everybody awkward, I would love to start the conversation, Brent, with a little bit of your background and moving into the financial discussion, which I think is going to take a large part of this conversation this afternoon, and then dive into some areas from there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm a veterinarian, and right after vet school, I graduated vet school quite a while ago. But right after vet school, I went into small animal exclusively for about 5 years full time. And after about 5 years, I wanted to do something different. So I started working at Royal Canin, and I've had various jobs at Royal Canin up to my current job. I'm still there now. And I actually still do a little bit of relief or locum work from time to time, not super often. And honestly, with COVID, I haven't done any in a while, but I like to stay grounded into what's actually going on at the clinic level too. And I miss the cats and the dogs. So it's a good chance to get back in there. But yeah, that's my professional side. But right at about the same time, I really started getting into personal finance kind of as a side interest.
Excellent. And was that something that you grew up getting to know and learn, or is it something that has evolved over time? And I think you shared a story in our pre-conversation about one of your colleagues that had brought that conversation up. I think it would be great to go into that a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. Actually, I came from a family who didn't really think about these sorts of things. We didn't save for the future, didn't do any of that. And so it wasn't something that I'd known, from early on, but actually I was in vet school, and I was doing an externship at a clinic, and this clinic turned out to be the one that I took my first job at. But one night, one of the other vets there, who his name's John Rowe, great guy. He was my mentor, both as a veterinarian, kind of from the medical perspective, but certainly from this side. He said, "Has anyone ever talked to you about retirement and saving for retirement?" And I said, "No, not at all." And he said, "Maybe it's something for you to consider as you take your first job." And I think one of the things, and this just speaks to John and his character, is like, we didn't know if I was going to work there. He was taking his time with just this vet student who he may never see again after this block, and just helping me out. And so he started explaining some things to me. But what really caught my eye is, as vets, we don't go into this for the money, but he said, if you start saving right after, you start working, by the time you retire, you could have over $1 million. And I remember, like, my eyes must have got really big, and $1 million, $1 million. And so, like, he showed me the math, and he showed me some charts, and it was like, well, yeah, why wouldn't I do this? And so after I finished that block, I went back and I ended up taking a job there. And I started kind of saving according to that plan. Eventually, I took a little bit to get on my feet, but I did. And, it was that moment that he sort of lit the fire. Once I went back to vet school, I bought my first ever personal finance book. It was called The Millionaire Next Door. And I bought it because it was new at the time, but I think it was because he just told me I could be that guy someday. Yeah. And then I don't know, I've been interested ever since. And I spend a lot of time, like my own personal time, when I'm not working, reading personal finance blogs or watching videos or reading books. It's something that it's turned into a real interest for me.
Excellent. And when you were at that time, so was this at your externship in your third year?
Fourth year. It was
into
a fourth
your
year.
So as you're going through your rotations in fourth year, and then you moved into your first year of practice, we discussed a little bit that you had some debt coming out of school. Depending on if you're comfortable sharing with that, and was that, and I want to follow that up with another question is, was that the impetus for wanting to move into this financial understanding and learnings? Did it feel like a burden on your shoulder, or was this just a personal interest because of this gentleman's approach?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think it was a little bit of both. When I came out of school, and I don't mind sharing, because I mean, if anything out of today for people, especially people who are earlier in their career, if I could be an example, like I'm happy to do that. I came out of vet school, and again, it's been a little while ago, but I had no ability to pay for any part of vet school going in. So I took loans for 100% of tuition and expenses. And at the time, that came out to be about $88,000 was my total debt load coming out. And my starting salary, not to date myself, but it was around $41,000. So my debt to income ratio was about 2, which if you flash forward to today, that's probably still in the right area of a ratio. I know the dollars are bigger on both sides now for the average debt of around, I think it's, the AVMA says it's around 150,000 and, commensurate with the salaries too. But, we're still in the same ballpark. So I was facing this sort of crushing like debt. And so there was a part that it was starting to spark a natural interest, I think, because it was math and it was, logical. But there was another part that was, it was fear, just kind of straight up fears. Like, if I don't figure out how to handle this, like it's going to handle me, and what do I do? And so that probably sparked me to go a little bit faster with it initially than I might normally have. But yeah, it was, I've been there. I hear what people talk about today, in terms of the debt and how it feels. And I remember that feeling, and having it myself, because it's an intense feeling. I mean, you're thinking, it's not like, well, maybe I won't be able to get the exact car that I want to get or whatever. It's like, I hope I can find, enough of my budget to make sure I've got meals covered for me and my pet by the end of the month. And, that's terrible. And all the things that we talk about with veterinary practice today with depression and leading to suicide, there's a lot of factors in it. And I think money's a big one of those. And I can definitely sympathize.
I just want to jump in. How old were you, Brent, when you had that discussion with your mentor, and then when you graduated?
Yeah, I was just about to turn 27 when I had that. And so, and that's a good question, because what he showed me like those actuarial tables that they say, if you put in this much money starting at this age, by the time you're 65 here in the US, here's what you'll have. And so he was like, see, you've got plenty of time, and, the later you start, the more you have to put in to do it. And so I was in my late 20s.
Okay. And going forward into the future, as you took on these courses and this understanding and education, did you share that with others that you were working with? Was this something that you kept to yourself?
I've always been kind of excited about this, like today, and eager to talk about it. Not everyone always wants to talk about it. My wife, for example, she's also a vet. She has no interest in personal finance. So she's just like, I trust you, you do what you think you need to do. But before we were married, when we were still just dating, I would kind of, give her advice, I guess, a little bit based on what I was learning. And I've definitely also this, because what I just spoke about with vets, that's no less true of veterinary technicians. And so I've always tried to sort of, money's a sensitive topic for people. And so if people don't want to talk, no worries, we don't have to. But if they're ever interested, I've always tried to sort of say, listen, time is your greatest ally in terms of saving and investing. So get started early. But it's funny you mentioned it, as I got into it, and I think this may be a story a lot of people who like personal finance can relate to, is, you start reading and you start thinking, oh, maybe I'm a day trader. Maybe I'm really good at this, because it all seems pretty logical. And you start, in a way, I mean, you can call it investing. It's probably closer to gambling, but like you start buying individual stocks and you start doing all of this stuff. And I remember one time I was investing in a particular stock at the time. It was MCI WorldCom. And I was so confident in how great it was going to do. I actually talked to my boss and I said, hey, I'm investing in this. I think it's going to go up. And he knew that I had been reading up on a lot of personal finance. And so he put some money into it. And then the company had a meltdown and the stock went to zero, which almost never happens to go to all the way to zero, but it did. And I was just like, okay, from now on, that is not cool. I'm not doing that, which I probably should say, this may be a good point to say, I used to, in one of my previous roles in Royal Canin, I was responsible for the regulatory nature of the business. I am not a financial professional. Excellent. I have no education. I am sharing my experiences today for either entertainment or education, or hopefully both. But for true financial advice, consult a financial advisor or a financial counselor. That is not me.
That is perfect and very, very applicable for this conversation. So thank you for being the preempt on that. Most definitely. For those that are at the start of their careers and are looking at that mounting debt and are looking at the payments, which in some cases are now going to be spread over the next 30 years, what do you tell those individuals, those veterinarians, those vet techs that are coming out of school and feel like they have no place to start?
I know that it's intimidating. I know that again, it's sometimes downright scary, but you have to sort of face into it. And the good news is as daunting as it may be, there's no better time to start than now. And maybe you don't know what to do, and that's okay. Like everybody's not going to have a super interest in it, but that's not, there's other ways to get to it. And that is to talk to a professional. I mean, if you like it, or you think, I don't know if I like it, maybe I might like it. There's a lot of great resources out there. There's a lot of places that provide free advice that's good. If you're pretty sure it's not your cup of tea, that's okay too. You can hire someone. And I know that's sort of like, well, that's expensive too. It doesn't have to be too expensive to get started, and they can at least get you set on the right path into the right habits. For me, when I started, I kind of went the free route because I did have an interest, and I got some resources here, like a book by Dave Ramsey. He's got a really good system, and he's got a podcast and some YouTube videos, and his system's really good. And I didn't do his thing exactly as he describes it, but pretty close. And then another one that I really like, Dave's probably what I would call your step one place. Yes. Step two is by Ramit Sethi, I Will Teach You to Be Rich. That's a little bit more advanced and probably like how to accelerate once you're already kind of going down that road. So those are some good free resources. But again, consult a financial advisor, there's this new sort of role coming out called financial counselor. And that's a little bit more around kind of the basics and getting all of your stuff lined up. It's not investment advice or anything like that. Like a financial advisor would be more of like, put your money in this fund or this stock or whatever. And so either of those I think are really good steps if you don't want to do it yourself. But again, to your question, it's like, even though it's intimidating, get started now.
Excellent. And not changing course, continuing the same themes, there's a feeling out there that if you can't get started right now, you're overwhelmed. I've been at times and there is more money going out than coming in. Mm-hmm. It can have a negative psychological effect. Like I'm speaking to myself right now. You want to get ahead, but you can't because the bills just keep piling up. The getting started is the first part, but then what do you do when, and I'm asking your opinion, your views, your past history, where you can't do it as well as what you think you want to do. And so say, hey, I'm going to put $1,000 aside every month, but guess what? At the end of the day, I could only put $200 or $300 a month that month. And that's almost just as deflating. How do you deal with that, Brent? What does that look like for you?
Yeah, and especially early on, it really did feel that way. There's a saying in personal finance that personal finance is more personal than finance. And that's because of all these feelings we have. You'll hear people refer to this as the money scripts that you have, basically how you grew up around money, what your experience with money, it all shapes some of these beliefs, some of which are probably not as accurate as we think they are. But nonetheless, they're sort of your set of beliefs, and so that's kind of what you're dealing with. And so, to your specific question, what I would say is, what may not feel like enough at this point in time is something. And so, whatever you can do, I recommend do. And if you want 1,000 and you're only able to do 100, hey, that's still 200. And that's, again, when you put time as a factor in here, that's actually going to be a lot more powerful than maybe it seems like at the time. But I think the other piece of that is maybe the bigger thing that I would zoom out to is, as much as possible, try to automate some of this stuff, because if you do leave it to yourself, that's when there's always going to be something. And when you're forced to make value judgments between should I do X or should I do Y, if you step back and you said clearly the answer is always going to be X, in the moment Y may overpower it. And so just don't as much as you can, try to avoid getting in those situations. Like for me, the first step, and again, there's a lot of paths to getting where you want to get financially. So by no means would I say that my way is the right way, but the first step that I took was a budget. And so just even understanding, what do I have coming in? What do I know I have going out, either fixed expenses or variables? And if they're variables, kind of what's the ballpark I should expect them to be in? And then start to look at it. And that step alone, for a lot of people, will be eye-opening, because in some cases it's not as bleak as it may feel, because now you're being intentional about it. When I started vet school, even I knew that money was always going to be tight, because you've got student loans and you don't have a job. And so I just got out an Excel file and just started listing expenses. I didn't really know I was creating a budget, but I was actually creating a budget at the time. And I've always been fond of spreadsheets, but there's all kinds of apps and other tools out there for whatever people watching or listening to this may prefer. But just do a budget. That's number one. And then there's different steps you can take from there, but that will help you start to see what you actually can do. And in some cases, it's going to be more than you thought you could.
That's excellent. Changing direction a little bit, Brent, definitely still along the same theme, is within your role now, the breadth of exposure that you have to different areas of veterinary medicine. Do you see the financial discussion becoming coming more to the forefront in the veterinarians that you describe, or is this more of a personal side that, when we got together here, you said, hey, I want to talk about this more openly? I bring that up as a question of pure curiosity.
I haven't seen it being spoken about as much. I think if you think about like what a financial advisor does, of, advising someone who sort of has, maybe a good sized nest egg, or at least a little bit of money to invest. Now, I think that conversation is happening more. I think there are a lot of financial advisors out there, and they're starting to get very specialized, and some are specializing to vets, and some are specializing to dentists. My younger brother he's a physician, and there's financial advisors who specialize just in physician finances. So I think on kind of the upper part, maybe there's more talk, but I think down in this getting started, when it isn't really about what's the right mutual fund, it's about, how do I even get started on this? That I think is still pretty open. And I wish we were having more conversations about it. And hopefully this one will spark that with some people.
I agree. And even the comment on what is a mutual fund versus an exchange traded fund versus all of the different automated systems that are coming out now. I'm envious and jealous sometimes of all the options in the US that are now available, which we unfortunately as Canadians can't take advantage of. But even in Canada over the last 4 or 5 years, that ability to automate is much improved. But if you're not seeking it out consciously, it can live in the background and be difficult to even know where to start. And again, that goes back to what is our theme of the day, it would seem. Mike, anything to add to that portion of the conversation?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's tying all of this together. I would agree. The number one most important step is get started. And I'm trying to think, how can we get that message out to people? Because you're right, Brent, money grabs all of these different money mindset and stories and emotions, and people attach them. And it's not the money that they're fearful of. It's the stories attached to it And then, like you said, that fear, and it gets to a point where fear will either paralyze you, or you have to overcome that and propel into action. And that is basically step one, is overcome the fear. Even though you don't know all of the answers, all of the steps, you just have to get going.
So true. One thing that I've seen that's positive in this direction, and unfortunately, it's probably not as common maybe for veterinarians working maybe in a single practice with just a couple of doctors, but some of the larger groups, as well as certainly if you move into an industry position, we're starting to see a bit more of around when the day that you join, you default into a certain percentage of your salary goes into a retirement plan, and you have to decide not to do that versus the other direction around, which is you have to decide how much to put into that. And so that's probably for some cases is helpful. But, when I was I worked for, and again, even where I do relief now is an independent practice, but for all of my career, like that wasn't the case. At one point, I remember them rolling out and saying, well, we have a retirement plan. If you'd like to participate, tell us how much you want to take out. And that was that was the end of it. Either you do, or you don't, and you say what, but there's no more guidance beyond that.
Yeah. And that's just not enough when you're looking at what's possible today, and really also how complicated it can be or how simple it can be. I want to jump back to Mike's comment, which spurs another question to you, Brent, is your money mindset and what that looks like now in 2020 compared to, when you were coming out of school. Mm-hmm. Fear-based, proactive-based, and the differences between them. Can you comment on that and what that looks like for you today versus back then?
Yeah. And I mean, you kind of hit on it. A lot of what I was doing was because I was scared of like, what does the future hold? And, after setting up a budget, what I did next was I started saving toward what people often refer to as an emergency fund. And it's like, setting back a certain amount of dollars, and you'll hear different people say different amounts. Usually like a minimum you hear is 1,000, but I was targeting a couple thousand because sometimes I worry a little bit. But basically, if you think about it at that point, when you have a car problem and you don't have the money to fix the car, you have a money problem now. And you have a money problem for two reasons. One, you have to pay to get your car fixed and you don't have that money. Two, your car probably takes you to where you make money. And so it's a big deal, but if you have, let's say, you have an emergency fund of $1,000. It's not going to fix every single type of car problem, but a lot of car problems now you can handle. It's not fun. You don't like writing, that check or paying it by credit card or whatever, but you can, and you just go on about your life. And so that was where I started, in my journey. And I bring that back to your question of, I had what people sometimes will refer to as the scarcity mindset, meaning there's a limited amount of money out there, and anything that you get must be taking away from someone or something else. Whereas I've kind of learned over time that generally speaking, that's not the case. That the opposite is what some might refer to as an abundancy mindset. But there is, there's a lot of ways out there, and this is more of a self-realization as a veterinarian, what we bring to the world is extremely valuable. And, again, nobody does it for the money, but at the same time, people will pay for it. And you shouldn't feel bad about that. Like you're doing what you're doing to make a living for you and your family. And that's fine. And people will pay for that. And so that was a big shift of mine, is like, as I became more experienced and just, in life and in work, it was a kind of a 180 on that.
Excellent. It's such a big piece. I struggle, and my ideal world would still be where veterinarians are proud of the money they make because of the great value that they bring to the clients and the pets we serve. I think that is necessary, and only going to be more necessary in future as we lose some percentages of what we can make in other ways. But professional services, I think we have to own that as veterinarians.
I agree.
We deserve to make every dollar we make and more on top of that. And that's all right. We shouldn't feel guilty about that. And there is definitely a guilt framework that's out there still. And how do you change that? How do you change that over time? I don't have the answer. I think it's, partially just being open and exposed like this.
Yeah, for sure. But I agree with you. I think it's out there. I think it's pretty prominent too. Like, if you said, do you think that's less now than when I started practicing? I'm not sure I've seen any difference. I think there's still quite a few vets who feel, maybe guilty about making money as a way to say it.
Yep, that's exactly it. And I had a colleague just very recently speak about a contract we're putting together for somebody, and her comment was directly, vets don't even want to negotiate hard if their way of negotiating is leaving and not even, joining in on the conversation. And that's so true. Mm-hmm. Because of that guilt feeling around money and what they feel they deserve.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Tough point. Mike, anything there? I could see you chomping at the bit a little bit there.
Well, I mean, our episode will run 10 hours if I start going. This is such an important thing to unravel, and it's going to take lots of conversations. The emotions that people attach to money, in my opinion, it's never about the money. It's always some unspoken emotion that's not coming out or coming to the surface when you're feeling kind of this guilt. And in listening to your story, Brent, I'm curious for you, and also I know for me, as I started checking off some of these boxes. So emergency fund is funded, X number of thousands of dollars is sitting in a bank account. I know for me, emotionally, a little bit of weight is lifted, because it's like, no matter what happens, that emergency fund is sitting there. And so the first step was the hardest step to take financially, because after that, the emotional burden was slightly lighter. So I don't know, was that your experience, Brent, or how did you work through going from like 88,000 in debt, but now I have an emergency fund, and now I'm only 86,000 in debt? Like, how did the emotions change on the journey?
Exactly as you described. That first bit of when you feel like you get that 1,000 or a couple thousand put back, and you don't want something to happen, but if it does, you can kind of say, well, okay, I'll just handle it. But then, what's next? And for me, it was to say, okay, now I've got that part sorted. How do I want to continue? And then it was like, well, let's accelerate my debt payoff. And so with that, I had started with the consumer debt. So kind of like bad debt, credit cards, store charge, car loans, mainly stuff that it's a depreciating asset, rapidly depreciating asset, and usually high interest rate. And so starting to retire those. And I use something you guys may, be familiar with it. And so the audience may be familiar with it, called the snowball method, where you take all of your debts and you line them up least to greatest. And in your budget, there was this amount of money that in my case, I was putting toward saving up an emergency fund. But now I've got my emergency fund where I want it to start. Now I take that money and put that extra toward debt. And by starting with the smallest, maybe it's a couple $100 on one credit card, once I get that knocked out, everything I was taking to my emergency fund and that credit card goes to my next smallest debt. And again, as I said earlier, the personal part of personal finance, it's about this motivation. And this is where I kind of made that shift from, like you were saying, like, oh my gosh, this is going to be hard. Mm-hmm. You get that emergency fund back, you can start to breathe a little easier. Then you actually start knocking small debts off. And it's like, not only can I breathe a little easier, I think I can do this. Now, it's not going to happen tomorrow. I mean, we're talking about it like a domino fell and another and another. I mean, this was years of work to do that. It's not fast, but you start to say, okay, well, I've done now 3 things. I've gotten an emergency fund. I've gotten one debt canceled. I've got a second debt canceled, and I'm working hard on its third debt. And that's going to be the time, just realistically, that life's going to throw you a curveball, and you're gonna take a couple steps back for every step you made forward. And I've been there too. I don't have a great example right off the top of my head, but you think you've got so much momentum, and then here comes something you didn't expect. Maybe like you're in an auto accident, or, you have some other health thing and you have an insurance claim, and it's like, okay, all right, move a few steps back. But then it's so much easier, I think, from that point though, to regain your momentum and move forward. And it's really, again, like all I can describe it as, you start to feel like, you know what, I'm making progress here. I'm not at the end of the road, not even sure I can see the end of the road, but I can see that things are going, into my rearview mirror. Yeah.
And I really think that's very important. The idea of the momentum, like stacking these personal wins, building the confidence. So when you hit that road bump, it maybe pauses you, or maybe it knocks you back a step, but your momentum is going to carry you forward, versus someone that hasn't even started. That road bump hits them backwards, and that's the direction they start traveling.
And then it gets even harder because you're behind the 8 ball then.
And you don't have options. I mean, like, there's, you may not think about it at the time, but when you're doing this, you are actually giving yourself options, because, you've built some habits. And again, this is why I love the automation aspect of this. If you can do it, is because, you've built some habits that just, now if something knocks you backwards, it's, as you say, you can take that step with the punch, and then you can kind of turn back into it and keep going. And if you can't, I think about, watching friends, both veterinarians and veterinary technicians, go through these challenging things. And it's something like that. There's nothing in reserve. And they, when they get hit back, one's enough, but sometimes they get 2, and it's just like, there's no recovering from that.
Yeah, I agree. Such an important topic, and a piece that we haven't even gone into, which I think is so relevant as well too, is with your significant other or your spouse. And how does that money conversation then go along the lines of when momentum's built? I can only use myself as a personal example. When we were first getting started out of school, we were both in debt, and that momentum that we built through what was equivalent of a snowball effect, it actually got us spurred into action to then go do some other investing and look at multiple income sources as a way of branching out and not then being dependent. It's a journey, and it definitely has its ups and downs. I don't, without needing to go into personal, has it been similar for yourself, Brent, in terms of that timeline, especially with both being veterinarians?
Yes, it has. And, I mean, this is a really good point, because of those money scripts that we talk about. The chances of you finding someone with the exact money script are not super high. So they're going to have different beliefs, and how do you meld those? Now, I'll tell you guys, like, there are so many ways in my life that my wife is a blessing to me. But for the purposes of this conversation, she was a real blessing financially, because she actually did come from a family who saved and who had good money habits. And so as I'm trying to learn these, it was like, I was sort of the bad influence one, and she was the good influence. And she would be like, well, why would we not save? Or why would we do that? Or, it was really helpful. So I completely acknowledge that, that was very fortunate for me. But it's not always that way. Sometimes it's Correct. 2 people have different habits, but neither of them are particularly the right way to go. And that can be hard, because, as we said earlier, these things are very hard conversations to have. I mean, we just, at least where we're in North America, like, you don't just talk about money. It's not a topic that everybody's that comfortable with. And so even with someone, your spouse, it can still be a hard conversation, at least initially.
That's correct. Yeah. And yeah, that evolves over time, and you learn and you go, and the struggles and successes. So we're just coming towards the end of our time period together already. That feels like we're just brushing on surface. So we may have to dive into this in another conversation as well too. Now, all 3 of us feel that. We are going to go into the impact round. And so our impact round is a set and series of questions for you, Brent, that are short, or you could take them as long as you'd like. And so our first question of the day is, are you a cat or a dog person?
Oh my gosh, I dress for the occasion. I don't know if you can see my shirt. It says, I'm an advocate. I'm a cat person.
Yeah. Cats are just taking it away.
Yeah. I love dogs. I love all species, but I'm a cat person.
Cat person. True or false? I wanted to be a veterinarian since I was a kid.
False. I did not decide that until I was an undergrad. And I honestly, I didn't have a lot of pets growing up. I was interested probably more for the science initially. And then, as you go, you can't help it. You just fall in love with the animals. But for me, I was kind of approaching it because it was a science, and it was really challenging, and
Okay.
all of those things, and then grew to really, really, really love animals as I went along. Whereas most people started with the animals and grow to love science. But yeah, I did it the opposite way.
Nice. How would your friends describe what you do for a living?
To be honest, they don't. They know I work at a pet food company. Most of them think that because I'm a veterinarian and I work for a pet food company, that I must be somehow involved in formulating the foods. And I don't.
Okay.
I don't work in formulation at all. So most of them don't know. The ones that know me really well, they know that I travel a lot, and they know that when I travel, I usually am going someplace to talk to other veterinarians about the food. So I guess that's probably how they would describe it.
Nice. What is your favorite hobby?
Well, I like music. I like to listen to music. I like to try to play music. I'm not very good, and I'm not being humble. I'm really not very good at it, but I like to get in and try anyway. And so music for me is a big hobby.
I'm breaking script. What kind of music do you like best?
I would have to say I love heavy metal.
Yes.
Yeah, I like that's just my favorite. I like a lot of stuff now. I don't want to come across as sort of that's the only genre, but like in terms of like on a day-to-day basis, what I like to have most queued up is heavy metal, some hard rock, and again, I like other stuff too, but that's probably the end of the spectrum I enjoy the most.
Excellent. For anybody that's not able to watch the YouTube version, there is a set of drums, and I see 4 different guitars in the background right now. It's fantastic. What in the world are you most grateful for?
My family. I mentioned my wife earlier, and she's been a blessing to me in my life in so many ways, but I would extend it on just beyond one person to my entire family.
That's amazing. So with that, before we come to a close, Brent, we've gone into a deep conversation today that, we hope to have you back on for, another conversation in future. But if there are those that want to personally reach out to you, start a conversation separately, where is the best place that they can get a hold of you?
Yeah, 2 places, kind of depending on, what they'd like to talk about. But I mean, certainly I welcome anyone to connect with me via LinkedIn. I'm on LinkedIn, Brent Mayabb, Mayabb. Let me know that, you're connecting kind of through this podcast, so I know the context, but connect there. And then for those, again, because guys, this is such a big thing for me. Like, if I can be of a personal help to share my story to others about, what I went through, and maybe that helps them kind of what they're going through, contact me directly. My email address is drmayabb@gmail.com, drmayabb@gmail.com. I'd be happy to talk to you again. I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not going to give you any personal finance advice, but just if I can give you motivation that, hey, I know this is hard, but you can do it, then I'd be happy to.
That's excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. Makes such a difference to our community, and I am hopeful and definitely appreciative of you putting that out there. Before we come to a close here, really appreciate your time today. Great to take on such a topic like this with someone like yourself that has gone through the experience, the struggles, and the successes. This has been a pleasure, and I hope we have the chance to do it again.
Yeah. Sure. And I just want to jump in and say, especially on this topic, Brent, because there's so much attachment with money, to have someone like you, a leader, step forward and not shy away, and in fact do the opposite and say, hey, I want to help tackle this issue with you guys. I mean, that's what we're trying to drive here, is have leaders like yourself step forward and inspire others. And I think you're definitely doing that.
Well, thank you both. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the kind words. And I mean, if I could just sort of leave your audience with, like, I know it can be daunting. I've been there, and you can do it. It's not easy and it's not fast, but you can do it. You're going to make mistakes. I made a ton of them. I shared the funny one of getting my boss into an investment that went to zero. I mean, you're going to do some wrong things. That's okay. Just as long as you're doing something and starting as soon as you can, in the long term, you're going to be the winner for it.
Thank you for listening to the Veterinary Project Podcast. As a recap on behalf of our hosts, the Veterinary Project Podcast will be releasing new episodes weekly, so be sure to tune in as we bring you more conversations aimed at helping you enjoy a life well lived. If you enjoyed what you heard on the show and you want to stay in the know, please like, love, and or subscribe to the podcast on the listening platform of your choosing, as we're available on all the usual suspects. If you know of others that may benefit from these conversations, we'd love it if you please share the show with them, as this will help us grow our community to reach more and more veterinary professionals. Speaking of which, if you are a veterinary professional and would like to get connected with more like-minded individuals who are joining us on this journey, please send an email to the veterinaryprojectpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll invite you to be a part of our private Facebook group. General feedback, requests for information, or perhaps requests to be a guest on the show can also be sent to the Veterinary Project Podcast @gmail.com. Dr. Michael Bugg and Dr. Jonathan Light, thank you for listening to the show, and we'll catch you again next week for another episode of the Veterinary Project Podcast. Bye for now.